guess the reason I've been quite quiet of late is because I'll just brief it really. It's just history repeating. And while people continue the same patterns, history will repeat. We're 6 months into this year, and I don't want to come across as well, we don't need a doom and gloom peddling merchant, do we? We've got enough of them online as it is. This is why the saturation point, I feel, has been reached. My own personal saturation point has really come because I have studied a lot of history. I'm interested in archaeological remains, layers upon layers of history that have been built on top of each other. And when you see the architectural buildings pre-Roman that the Romans built their foundations upon, which history denies, but you can clearly see with your own eyes, you take it back that far, and then you start looking at the other layers, the underground high streets, the buildings that poke out of hillsides seemingly. We have to understand that for one reason or another there's been many resets, many historical resets of the slave race that we call mankind, and the latest one is, it's almost an exact repeat of the 1918 Spanish flu scenario. The same players are involved, from Gates's father through to radio waves, through to racism, wars, social division, left and right politics, economic depression following. It's to somebody like myself, and I really have spent many thousands of hours studying global history, especially modern history, and very much from a social point of view, to understand how it will affect my future on this realm. You know, our 70 or 80 odd years that we have, how to grasp and how to get a good understanding of it. Now, this history repeating can't get more obvious after the testing of the radio waves, the sickness of the Spanish flu, than what I'm about to tell you now. In 1919, there was a situation known, well, it was known as Red Summer. You won't find this in your history books, or you'll find it in books, of course you will, but you won't find it as part of a curriculum, and it won't be told to you. So I'm going to tell it to you now. In 1919, there was race riots called the Red Summer in America and Britain. Hundreds of people were murdered across the US and the UK, and men, women and children, and they don't want you to know about it. Everyone compared, I was comparing this to the Spanish flu, this so-called Kobe, but a lot of people don't realise the other similarities around the radio waves, obviously, and this Red Summer. Well, at the time, Woodrow Wilson, who was a supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, was president of America, and he was heavily against black suffrage and basically raised elements of white American society. And white-led race riots and lynchings were fairly commonplace from around 1890 to 1918, and more than 3,000 people were lynched. 2,500 of them were black men and 50 black women, because at that time black people still had fewer rights than white people. But apparently what made this summer even worse all round was the return of the soldiers from World War I. And where have we heard that before, the mistreatment of soldiers coming back to America especially? I mean, I'm old enough to remember Vietnam, well, the aftermath of Vietnam, and how the Vietnamese, the American soldiers that served, were treated wrongly. Actually, they shouldn't have been there, that's not the point, but their own people turning on them, just disgraceful. Well, obviously in America for World War I, white and black soldiers were mobilised, and when they returned home, as with most young men with war, they were suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. there was a lot of violence around, and what triggered it was fabricated rumours, where we're hearing this before in the media mainly, of white women being assaulted by Negro fiends, and they were sensationalised by the press. And then white mobs went on a random sprees of assault and murder. The Washington Post, left-wing, absolute gobshite of a news media outlet back then. They have made some good pieces in the modern times, but back then they were a leftist piece of filth. Ran a front page story organising white servicemen to gather at a certain location so they could attack black people in the city en masse. So again, fuelled by the media. This time it was kind of the reverse of what we're seeing in a way, but exactly the same tactics. There was no jobs, and there wasn't many homes. There was a pandemic, and the country had been ravaged by war. And at that point there was mass migration. Over 500,000 African Americans had moved to the industrial cities. Between 1910 and 1920, the population of Chicago, for example, grew by 148%, and Philadelphia by 500%. We've got mass migration occurring now. We've got open borders occurring now throughout Europe. This is history repeating. I'll continue with what I'm gathering from this. At the time, of course, a lot of the black migrants, they prospered and created a black middle class, and this really wound up the pro-white media, and obviously the term white privilege was used then, back in 1919. It was to ensure that the black population didn't rise up to meet the middle class values. What we're seeing now, of course, is everybody being reduced down financially, who doesn't matter where you are, what you are, colour, race, creed, religion, you are being treated on the whole exactly the same during this Kobe. So, Red Summer, it was a phrase that was actually coined by the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured Peoples, NAACP, Field Secretary James Weldon Johnson. The most serious of them started in April and it ended in November. What a lot of people don't realise is obviously the Ku Klux Klan were massive there. But the UK, I mean, okay, there were riots in America lasting a week. 1,000 to 2,000 people lost their homes, 537 people injured in a week, 38 deaths. So there were riots happening. As we've seen race riots occurring, history repeats, as I say, we've seen race riots occurring across America every decade or so, or every 20 years and more, one flares up. It's a well-worn tactic. Not a well-worn tactic of the races involved. I mean a well-worn tactic of the one-winged government, if you like. Now back to Britain. Riots happened in Britain as well in 1919, and it was part of the Red Summer. They occurred in London, Glasgow, Liverpool, Cardiff and Hull. 5 people were murdered, all non-white. The soldiers returned from a longer war than the Americans, obviously. Same kind of hardships and the same kind of mass migration, and we're starting to blame South Asian, African, Afro-Caribbean, Chinese and Arabs. So why don't we know about this? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Myself understanding the global resets and the wiping out of history, it would seem obvious that this wouldn't be put in any school curriculum, that you would have to look for this, or it be presented to you one day like it's been presented to me, and you take an interest. Otherwise, you're just not going to know about it. You might start hearing about Red Summer now, obviously, over the next few days. But did you hear about Red Summer before? Because I didn't, in all honesty. And upon reading about it and finding out that this is history repeating, and having, as I say, I appreciate this video might not make a lot of sense, but I've visited ruins of buildings and ruins of civilizations that were built before the Roman times, where the Romans laid their roads on top, built their palaces on top. That's a layer of history, and one can be easily dumped upon another. And from what I understand, we haven't learnt that much, us humans. We have silicon chips, but little else. Cheers.